This also shows me that the argument that this is about self-defense for Russia is
Mhm.
wrong, or that this is about defense against NATO is
Oh,
wrong.
yeah, because they're destroying any human capital for self-defense capacity that they
Yeah,
have,
if
right?
he was actually worried about self-defense, he would have stopped the war a long time ago. Leaving a government like that in power in the Ukraine was not worth a guaranteed death of his entire ethno-cultural group,
Yeah.
which is what he is putting in place.
You see, killbots have a preset kill limit. Knowing their weakness, I sent wave after wave of my own men at them until they reached their limit and shut down.
Like, we should stop sending billions to the Ukraine. Like, whoa, don't you know that a lot of it is being like funneled back into Democrat politicians' pockets and stuff like it? It's like, yeah, all of that is true. But you know what we're not sending to the Ukraine right now? Our own people.
Because it's neutralizing what was once a non-trivial threat
Not a
from a
non-trivial
national
threat.
security
The single
standpoint.
greatest threat to America's geopolitical power for the last century.
Would you like to know more?
Hello, Simone. I'm excited for you to bring some stats to the table. Stats episodes are always the best, but I also want to apply sort of geopolitical knowledge to a world issue that I've noticed, especially within right-leaning communities. There's a lot of misconceptions about what's going on and what the motivations are of various players.
Yeah, I titled our stupid StreamYard room Russia. I do not think that country means what you think it means, which is the thing that came across my inbox this week, which I thought was fascinating. So a very underrated Substack called Axis of Ordinary by Alexander Krull is a daily part of my reading routine, even though I have cut pretty much everything else out, sadly, due to workload and whatnot. But y'all check it out. It's great. He has a lot of spicy links. A lot of it's AI, a lot of it's Ukraine, and then some of it's psychology and science. He'll share a roundup of links with short summaries. Very great Substack. It's free to subscribe. And he's a very thoughtful person, though I've never talked with him. I don't know him. But on a recent roundup, a daily roundup that he shared this about Russia, which very much surprised me. So he starts with a quote from Vladimir Putin. Russia's cultural and ethnic diversity is Russia's strength. Our state was built around the values of multi-ethnic harmony. Then Krull proceeds to write, many people on the political right admire Russia and see Putin as the savior of white Christendom. What they don't know is that Russia is a higher percentage of Muslims than, say, Germany, and it's not because of an open border policy. Worse, instead of building a wall, Putin has sacrificed thousands of Russian soldiers, not only to keep Muslims in Russia against their will, but to give them Russian passports, which has led to numerous major terror attacks, such as the Beslan school massacre that ended with the deaths of 334 people, which I haven't even heard of. At an official event where Putin gifted a copy of the Quran during a visit to a mosque, he noted that the desecration of the Quran is a crime in Russia. Nikita Zuralev, a teenager who burned a Quran, was extradited to Chechnya under Putin's watch. There he was tortured and beaten on camera. In 2015, Putin inaugurated the Moscow Cathedral Mosque, a city where tens of thousands of Muslims fill the street for Eid prayers. Russia has also introduced the Islamic banking system. P.S. One of Russia's most famous TV hosts, the Jewish Vladimir Solovyov, recently chanted Allahu Akbar in front of Russia's Islamist mercenaries. So I think the biggest thing that really surprised me here was this note about Germany, that there's a higher percentage of Muslims in Russia than Germany. Wild, because everyone, you have this vision of Russia, which is these blonde bombshell women and these stoic, statuesque men, right?
Well, the vision, I mean, I want to be clear, and this is where people get Russia wrong. They get it wrong for a few core reasons. One is they are aware that there is this superficial view of Russia that was the way we painted them as our enemy in the Cold War.
Yes, yeah.
And then there's the new view of Russia, which is coming because of Putin's PSYOPs campaigns in the West. Specifically, he wanted to appeal to right-leaning political groups, and he did that by acting as if he was like this. And keep in mind, like, we've got nothing against Muslims or anything like that. But what I would say is that the image that a lot of people have of Putin is not correlated with his behavior at all.
Yeah, he represents a bastion of, well, they say Western culture, Western civilization, but really people are referring to broadly Christianity, if I have
Yeah,
that
they're
right.
referring to like an old school, like homophobic, which Russia is. I should be clear about that. White centered Christian,
Yeah.
and a lot of people, as we point out, I mean, racists are generally dumber than the general population, so it's very easy to confuse them with these sorts of tactics. And a lot of them have actually been swayed into believing this iteration of Putin and believing his motivations around this war. Because I think the question could be, is you could say, well, why is Putin doing all this if his goal is the savior of like old European values and a return to, Christendom and a return to ethno states? And it's because that's not what Russia is doing. That is not why they are invading the Ukraine. That has nothing to do with it. This idea of they're not, and a lot of people on the right I've actually seen believe this, like a right-wing conspiracy theorists, that there are like Nazis in the Ukraine, which there were Nazi sympathy groups in the Ukraine that were bigger than in other regions, but they were not like, it wasn't like the country was about to become a Nazi state or something like that, right? This would be the same way that the left will find, somebody making okay signs at a rally and then be like, oh, we're going to go attack them because 4chan, this is a long story about how this became a thing in the US. But there are occasional Nazis in like US rightist groups as well, right? If we allowed that to be used as justification for the extermination of those entire populations, like that's quite another thing. And that isn't his justification, because that's not what he's fighting for, right? He's not fighting for a return to this whole system.
If you're wondering just how little Putin cares about Nazism as a serious threat, here is the guy who named the Wagner Group the primary fighting group he has in the Ukraine right now, covered in Nazi tattoos. Here is a Wagner soldier covered in Nazi tattoos.
So the question is, what is he fighting for? Like, what motivates Russia's foreign policy decisions? Well, when you look at Russia's recent history since Putin came to power, and even before that to an extent, it becomes clear what's motivating Russia. The mistake is seeing Russia as a nation state, because it doesn't think, act, or is motivated like a nation state. It is motivated like a oil and gas cartel, really like a mob that makes the majority of its money from oil and gas. And when I say the majority of its money, over 50% of the state revenue in Russia comes from oil and gas. That's huge. It motivates their every decision. Like, I can't overstate how big that would be if 50% of your state's revenue, and the state was a totalitarian state, was a single leader, was coming from one industry. Basically, that means that state leader is basically CEO of a company in that industry with no laws that apply to them, interested in advancing the cause of that industry. And we can see this because of how much money Putin has been squirreling away. He hasn't been using the money that he's generating to improve, Russia's quality of life or anything like that. He has been taking huge amounts and squirreling it away for his descendants. So the question is, well, where do you see this in foreign policy, right? Well, so first, when the Soviet Union broke up, their first goal, and I'm going to put a video here. There's a great video if you want to go into this in great detail, where they go over this in way more details, but I'm just going to give you the top notes.
If you find these topics interesting and want to go much deeper on them, as well as look into sources, I strongly suggest a video called Russia's Catastrophic Oil and Gas Problem by Real Life Lore, which is one of the best summaries of this particular subject I've seen on the internet.
There's a huge problem with a lot of oil in Kazakhstan, because that could be a competitor to Russia. So they made a point of owning 42% of their oil pipelines and industry, and they're basically a client state, so they don't really worry about them. And then they ensured that all of the oil that was going out of Kazakhstan was being shipped through Russia, through pipes that go through Russia and out of Russian port. Azerbaijan also had a lot of oil in the region, but Azerbaijan could only get its oil out without going through a Russian-controlled area or one of their enemy areas, by putting a pipeline through Georgia. What happened immediately after they put this pipeline through Georgia? Russia invades Georgia.
Mhm.
Okay. Let's go a bit further into the future.
Wait, what about all that news coverage about Putin having this obsession with Russia's history and this
We're going to get
narrative?
to that in a second. I'm just going
Okay.
over the data first. Okay.
All right. Yeah. This is interesting.
All right. So then a discovery gets made in the Ukraine. That Ukraine controls Europe's second largest known reserves of natural gas. And almost 80% of that is east of the Dnieper River, which is important. So they were then in talks with, they had deals signed with Shell, Exxon, and Mobil to come in and produce that gas. Well, that was a huge chunk of that was under those contracts was in the Donbass. That was the region that Russia first annexed a while back. That ended up invalidating all of the contracts that they had signed to improve this. And to give you an idea of how much this would matter to Russia, right now their primary competitor in that space is in Scandinavia. But this coming onto the market would represent 3x what Scandinavia is bringing to the market in terms of a competitor. This is actually sort of existential for Russia to stop, because, and a lot of people are like, yeah, but they're not like, they do the math. They're like, okay, but even if they capture all of these reserves and then start selling them, it doesn't add to their bottom line budget that much. And it's like, bro, you're completely misunderstanding their goal here. Their goal is not to sell it, it's to prevent it from entering the market. When Russia attacked, they had just gotten the Ukraine, they had just gotten another pro-Rest president, and things were beginning to look stable enough for the oil companies to begin investing in developing these assets, which would have been really catastrophic for Russia. And we need to, to get an idea of how much Russia thinks about this sort of stuff. For a while, I think it was up until, as late as 2005, 80% of Russian oil went through the Ukraine Brotherhood network. And this was always causing conflict between Russia and the Ukraine, because the Ukraine would ask for like charge fees on this. And a lot of conservatives are like, well, the Ukraine was just robbing Russia, and so it makes sense that they had to go in to gain control of this network, right? But that's actually false. Russia had already built, by the time the war had started, the 2 Nord Stream pipelines and a separate pipeline that went south around the Ukraine, and they weren't shipping nearly as much oil through the Brotherhood network anymore. So no, it was not about access to those pipelines. Anyone who is telling you that is lying to you. That wasn't what was causing the conflict anymore. The conflict was the development of these new natural gas. And so being an oil company that also runs a state, something like this makes sense if you fundamentally do not care about your citizens. And this is where it gets really interesting, and where what Russia did becomes so absolutely insane in the light of what you're hearing. Like, oh, are they building, like, I've heard that he really cares about the history and everything like that and blah, blah, blah. Russia has a desperately low fertility rate. Ukraine has a desperately low fertility rate. He's basically killing an entire generation of young men. And much more.
And he must know it. He can't be blind to this for sure.
Much more than you would have in a historic context. So it was really fascinating. Like, this is the first time in history a nation is essentially genociding itself through something that is really, really interesting about the war. What one is either like 2 of the most culturally aligned groups in the world, right? Like, he's killing his own people with his own people. Like, if you care about like the Slavic nationality, this is the very last thing you would do if you had an eye to fertility rates. Peter Zeihan theory, we'll get to it in a second. It's also probably super wrong. I don't agree with everything Peter Zeihan says. I think he's smart, but I think he's wrong that this is being, well, I'll just get to the theory right now. Okay.
Yeah, dive into it.
Peter Zeihan thinks that the reason that this war is happening is twofold. One is Russia wants additional population, and this is their last chance to really make a play for these resources, demographically speaking, which is true. And the second is they're trying to capture choke points, which are important for invasions into their territory. And they think that by capturing the region of the Ukraine, they can capture more of these choke points, and so they're sort of forced into this war. I do not think that is it. The truth is while Russia pretends that NATO wants to attack it all the time, anyone who has the barest context of reality knows that NATO is a bunch of pussies. They are not going to wage an aggressive war. They may, if they were able to loop Ukraine into their dealings, it was because Russia was threatening Ukraine. Like, NATO couldn't even get Sweden and Norway in, right? Because of Russia's saber rattling. You really think they were going to get the Ukraine in? Realistically speaking, no. It's just silly argument there that they were forcing to do this because he had kept Sweden and Norway from even joining NATO, which are like hugely culturally aligned with Europe, until he did this, which then gave them the cover to join. So no, that would have, and very obviously that would have been the consequence of this attack. So no, that was stupid as well. That is not why he was doing this. But then the second thing is to Peter Zeihan's play. Okay, so he's going out there and he's trying to capture these choke points. But choke points don't matter in the type of war that he needs to defend against. The type of war that he needs to defend against are people coming in and assassinating him, or people fermenting unrest within his population. That's the way the Western world takes people out. And it's the way the Western world has taken people out for a while at this point, outside of countries that are, that have any way to protect themselves.
Well, he seems duly afraid of that as well.
No, I mean, when we go to countries that, like, when we go to war, right, they're often countries that don't have like big formal militaries. They are multiple levels below us in the tech tree in something like Civ. Russia is not like that to us. They have nuclear weapons. We're not going to go in and attack them in that way. And as such, he needs to focus much more on maintaining local support, which he had done pretty well. Then he needs to go out and try to capture like geographic choke points. He needs to focus much more on the international politics, which he was doing very well. He was bringing.
So what's going on? Is he losing his mind? Like,
no, we'll get to it. He's not. It was all an economic play for him. But we'll get to the economic play in just a second.
So he's poorly prioritizing, is what you're saying.
He's very poorly prioritizing, and it's actually incredibly stupid prioritization, and we can get to why in just a second. But he had won a major victory in turning the U.S. right to become a pro-Russian party and the European right to become a pro-Russian party. And I think that he lost that with like basically all of the sane thinkers who aren't just like conspiracy people who believe all the stuff that's being fed to them. And so then we want to talk about like the self-genocide of Russia. So Russia's in a very unique position from a global history perspective in that they are able to genocide themselves. See, historically speaking, if I was a country like Russia and I was just sending all of my young men to another country to die, and they were dying at the rates that they're dying right now, I would have some restraint. Like I would keep some men home, right? Because I need to be able to defend the homeland. The way they are acting isn't like that. They are not acting as if they are trying to, it's like that famous scene.
How are you doing this, Vincent? How have you done any of this? We have to go back. It's too late for that. We're close to the other side. What other side? You want to drown us both? You want to know how I did it? This is how I did it, Anton. I never saved anything for the swim back.
Except they need them to make babies, and they are just dying in numbers that you would. And this also shows me that the argument that this is about self-defense for Russia is wrong, or that this is about defense against NATO is wrong.
Oh yeah, because they're destroying any human capital for self-defense capacity that they have.
Yeah, if he was actually worried about self-defense, he would have stopped the war a long time ago and just, stuck on what he had. Like that the moment that he realized this was going to be a long slog, or last year, or at any point, even now, he should stop, because his country is becoming weaker and weaker and weaker in terms of if NATO actually did decide to attack. And the rest of the world no longer respects his country as like a place to do business. Now, a lot of people can be like, oh, but he went into this war thinking it would be a quick war. Quick war or long war, it still went against his best interests, and he knew it wasn't going to be a quick war. It was in like the first few months of the war, so he should have recalibrated. He should have stopped sending men to die. So you could say, oh, but he's doing all of this for some sort of like ancient reunification goal.
Yeah, back to what I kept reading about him, that this had nothing to do with logic. It was about a narrative of Russia that Putin is obsessed with restoring.
Yeah, so there is something in wars called Casus Belli. And anyone who has played, Europa Universalis or Kings, Crusader Kings 2 or 3, Casus Bellis are very important. You can't just attack a territory without having a reason to attack the territory. Even the US does this. Everyone does this. They make up some logical justification for attacking the territory. He can't say, I need to prevent them from getting these natural gas deals done. So what he says is, and he had a very strong Casus Belli, like Ukraine was, from a certain standpoint, unjustly separated from Russia, right?
It's very important when you're examining any war that's happening to not misconstrue the Casus Belli for the actual motivation for going into war. Look at something like Vietnam is a great example. The Casus Belli for the war was that we did not want the Vietnamese people to suffer under a communist dictator. But the actual motivation for the war was domino theory in fighting against communist expansion, where they were our primary geopolitical rivals. To put it another way, a Casus Belli is how you explain the war to your heart. But it's not logically why you're actually spending the billions of dollars that it actually costs to go into a war, nor the lives of your people during the war. Now, if an individual's looking at this and they're like, come on, a major world power wouldn't go to war just over oil and gas. And here I just have to like, what world have you been living in the last century? If you think that oil and gas was even a major motivator in some of America's recent wars, consider that over 50% of our government's income is not funded by those industries directly, okay? In Russia, it is. And the guy who owns all of those companies, practically speaking, is also the guy who runs the entire government.
Like, I am not actually against his justification for the war. The justification does make, within like a historic context of why you can declare wars, it makes logical sense. There was a Russian population in the Ukraine. There was political unrest in the Ukraine that could be tied to Nazi groups. Like, all of that can look very aesthetically good. The problem is that as soon as he realized the actual cost of the war, even with all of that justification, leaving a government like that in power in the Ukraine was not worth a guaranteed death of his entire ethnocultural group.
Yeah.
Which is what he is putting in place. I mean, he will be remembered in history as the man who killed the Slavic people in the Slavic world. It is that anyone, and this is where like I'm often like people are like, oh, but he's sort of winning at times, and it's like, his theory for war, and we've literally seen this, is the Zapp Brannigan theory of war.
The killbots? A trifle. It was simply a matter of outsmarting them. You see, killbots have a preset kill limit. Knowing their weakness, I sent wave after wave of my own men at them until they reached their limit and shut down. Kif, show them the medal I won.
And that's basically his strategy right now, is just wave after wave of a scarce and increasingly scarce commodity for Russians, which is human beings, which are dying out in Russia. And you could say, well, you could fix this with some form of like polygyny or something like that among the remaining Russians. And it's like, it doesn't have a cultural background for that. And I don't see him as implementing that.
I don't see that working. No.
Yeah. What's going to happen is they've already lost like basically all of their talent, which is hugely important. If you create an action that makes every man who is like a competent programmer or a competent worker in any extent leave the country, which largely happened, the exodus of young men from the country was catastrophically large. You have made your country, like in terms of like genetic and cultural selection effects, markedly less competent and less able to compete in where the future of the world is going. And so, you know, I'll title this episode something ultra provocative, like Putin is more of a, or people who sent for Putin are like more pathetic than the people who sent for Biden. Because in truth, Biden is a better leader than Putin. With as bad as Biden is, at least he's not genociding his own ethnic group, you know. And I'd also point out now, a lot of people are like, why is the US fighting here? Like, we should stop sending billions to the Ukraine. Like, whoa, don't you know that a lot of it is being like funneled back into Democrat politicians' pockets and stuff like it? It's like, yeah, all of that is true. But you know what we're not sending to the Ukraine right now? Our own people. And people are like, what? The US fight Russian interests? That would never happen. Excuse me. Like, is history not taught anymore? Our last like two giant bloody wars, both Vietnam and Korea, were about fighting Russian interests.
Well, even the last war that was, you know, really, really big in society was the Cold War, you know?
Yeah, all of it. And Russia, if you look at my sister-in-law actually worked in counterterrorism, was in Georgia for a while.
To clarify, she is an American without any Georgian sympathies. She was just working in Georgian terrorism because that is where there were more active terrorists when she was trying to learn her chops. And I mentioned the Georgia part to show just how much she knows about the geopolitics of Russia specifically.
And she's an expert in this space. And she's like, look, all of the, like, if you look at the actual like probability of war between countries, the probability of war between the United States and Russia is still by far the highest in the world of like any major power. Like
Just because of the nuclear arsenal? Is that
it has to do with the state control structure, the economic interests that we have, and the lack of economic ties that we have. Whereas something like a war with China, unless they like literally just go crazy, is much less likely because they are so reliant on imports for like basically economically surviving. Whereas the same isn't true for Russia. I mean, you could see even with all the sanctions, because so much of their state is dependent on oil. They
isn't Iran then in a similar position?
Yeah, Iran is in a similar position, and there is a high likelihood of war between the U.S. and Iran, which is one of the reasons we're always so like feisty with them. But yeah, so there was a
haven't been very feisty with them.
There was a high likelihood of a future war with Russia. And the fact that Russia has now, and in terms of what wars cost, like I would encourage you to look at the cost adjusted, like what did the Korean War cost us? What did the Vietnam War cost us?
If you're too lazy to go and check this, the entire Ukraine war so far has cost us half of what we would spend on the Vietnam War in just 1 year. And keep in mind that the Vietnam War lasted 10 years. And that war wasn't even directly about weakening Russian interests or killing Russians. In this war, Russia is literally depleting their own military potentiality permanently. Now here you might be saying something like, well, that's quite monstrous of you to use Ukrainian fighters for US's long-term geopolitical interests. And it's like, they're choosing to defend the territory on their own. Russia chose to attack the territory on their own. And if you're like, oh, the US goaded Russia into this, not really. This was almost an entirely self-imposed mistake on Putin's part. The US, up until this point, was just being a fairly normal, rational geopolitical actor in this space, doing the same types of one-sided, self-favored deals that we do all over the world every day. This was Putin self-owning himself in an attempt to maintain control of the oil and gas market while doing something that he felt worked from a, Casus Belli situation. I do feel for the pain of the Ukrainian people who are in this war, but also, rationally speaking, if you just look at Russian client territories, if Russia does win this war, the Ukrainian people will live worse lives than they will live if Russia wins this war. Like, they are not fighting for nothing. They are fighting for something meaningful. Whether or not you support Russia, this is just a rational and obvious truth. And I want to be extremely clear here that I have no antagonism against the Russian people as humans or as an ethnic group or as a cultural group. In fact, I have a number of ethnically Russian friends and even friends who live in Russia. That said, none of the friends that I have that are in Russia or ethnically Russian support the war, and most of them, actually all of them, have fled the country in response to this war that was not directly caused by the United States. That we can utilize this war to deplete the part of Russia who will fight for an autocrat for stupid made-up reasons is not a terrible thing, even for the Russia people, if we are going to have any chance at the sane part of the Russian population, i.e. the sane ones who see through Putin's bullshit and are willing to take risks to stand up against it, repopulating what is left of the husk of the country when Putin is done with it.
For pennies on the dollar, we basically tricked Russia into genociding itself because of a massive miscalculation that they're making. I don't care if 90% of that money is going to graft. I don't care if 98% of that money is going to graft.
Because it's neutralizing what was once a non-trivial threat from a national security standpoint.
The single greatest threat to America's geopolitical power for the last century. I just... People have short memories. They're familiar with who our most recent enemy is, and a threat that is likely in the future going to become an extremist Muslim power. And a lot of people are like, what? I'm like, just look at the demographics, man. Like all of the infrastructure in Europe, like if that's who you're afraid of from those stats that Simone was talking about, if you're afraid that Germany is going to become an extremist Muslim power, Russia's already, getting people like beaten to near death for burning the Quran at like the executive level. They already have more Muslims per capita. And I, again, have nothing like Muslims come in many different stripes. And there are lots of groups of Muslims that are very useful to a country and can work well within pluralistic societies. But there are also lots of groups of Muslims that can't. The ones in Russia are the ones that keep doing the terrorism. How do I know that? Because they keep doing the terrorism. It's a huge problem that Russia already has. There are already efforts to overthrow the government among Muslim extremist groups. And they're often some of the biggest organized military powers within the Russian regime. So if Russia got weak, one very likely thing would be one of the extremist Muslim groups that is already military and is mad at Putin for killing their young men for no reason, if this war fails, might just make a run on the capital. And we saw that with a culturally aligned group with Prigozhin, but because a lot of people in Moscow still support Putin, a lot of people, you would need sort of an outside cultural group to really do this. And that's why it's incredibly likely that if there is some sort of conflict in Russia, it would be the extremist Muslims that take over.
That would be such an interesting twist in terms of at least how Americans view Russia, because it's so out of left field. It's the last place I would have expected to have.
Country, Russia regularly gets taken over by, hordes of nomads. That's just like a historic thing that come from within its borders.
A thing that happens.
Yeah. So I think that even if that's your take, it's important to like wake up and realize that Russia is not what Putin paints it as within the propaganda that you are getting as a Westerner. That propaganda is propaganda. It is meant to manipulate you. But I want to hear your thoughts, Simone.
I'm just so surprised. I think the weird thing is that despite hearing all this and reading all this, I'm still going to view Russia the way that I did since I was a child watching, what was that show called? Rocky and Bullwinkle. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's interesting to me how solidified Russia specifically is in my mind, perhaps because of the Cold War, which we grew up right at the close of it, or we were born right at the close of it, in the very late 80s. So it's just weird to me that this, you can say all this stuff, but it's just not going to stick with me. Russians are still going to be Russians.
Like a rightist versus leftist thing. So a great example of this is, until fairly recently, a quarter of Germany's power was coming from nuclear power plants. Mm-hmm. Coincidentally, right as they were building the Nord Stream pipelines, the Green Party, which is supposed to care about the environment, decides based on like the urging of Greta Thunberg, who I have reason to believe gets a huge portion of her funding from Putin and Russian interests, the campaign to get those all taken down. There are many leftist agents, especially within the environmentalist movement, that are specifically being elevated and used by Russia for this, oil goal. It's not like the Russia only supports rightist politicians. They'll support the Green Party in the way that they're attempting to brainwash populations if that is of utility to them, because like it's insane. Why would you do that?
Well, why can Russia be so inept with the war effort, with all this stuff, but then nail propaganda in a way that, at least in our opinion, other nations aren't? And other people who, specialize in national security have been insistent that China's amazing at manipulating.
China's terrible at propaganda.
Well, that's what we think. But anyway, so we think Russia's masterclass level at manipulating our perception. Why are they sucking at everything else and not this?
Well, so as to why specifically they're good at propaganda and China is bad at propaganda, it is twofold. The bigger one is they culturally understand us much better. China thinks that they can undermine the average American citizen's trust and faith in the government by pointing out to the average American citizen that their government is like corrupt or bad. And it's like, that does nothing. They're like, look at your politicians. They're corrupt. And your average American is like, yes, that's like core to our cultural understanding. And they're like, no. Look at your country. It did a bad thing overseas. Americans are like, yes, we're taught that in elementary school. The government pays to teach us that. We are very immune to propaganda that is meant, because in China, that would be seen as like catastrophic. our government did something naughty. They did the Tiananmen massacre. Our politicians are corrupt or don't have our best interest at heart. That would be catastrophic to a Chinese person, because they think that way. They can't model America well. In Russia, and among the populations that Russia uses to do these things, most Russians know that they can't really trust their government. They've known this since communist times. This has been like a core thing within Russia for a long time. So the way that Russia ends up doing its overseas political operations is it ends up elevating the extremists on both sides. Sometimes with direct affiliation, sometimes without direct affiliation. So that's why they're funding both, QAnon conspiracy theories as well as Greta Thunberg. That's why they're funding, both far left Green Party people, because they're trying to, and this was found in the Trump election. A lot of people are like, oh, the election integrity stuff on the left was all phony. And a lot of it was. Like, I don't think this was a phony campaign on the left. But what was true, and we have the receipts for this, is that Russian operatives within environments like Facebook would start competing protests and then trick them into appearing at the same location to try to get them to fight each other. This was what Russia was doing. They were trying to get you Americans to fall into more extremist positions,
which is
and fight other Americans.
Funny. It's so good. That's
Well, that's how you trick Americans. You don't trick them by saying your government hates you. You say, oh, the people on the other side, they're actually way more bad than you've been told. Nuts. And all Americans know this secretly. And they're like, yeah, they are more bad. And here's what you can do. And then they get them in an environment where it causes direct civil conflict. This is, if you look at something like Antifa, if you are a rightist right now, and you think, oh, Russia founded some pro-Trump stuff, I would almost guarantee if you follow the money, almost all of the money that Antifa is getting is coming from Russia. They'd say, oh, it's true Marxists within Russia that are funding them, because they're dumb as bricks. And they talk about who their funding is coming from. And we know that it's coming from people who they consider true Marxists. Where do they think that's coming from? These are tankies, right? I don't know if people know what a tanky is. That's a type of progressive that thinks that the Russian style communism is actually good. And
It's so funny. I forgot. And then you said tankies, and I'm like, oh, anime girls, but that's still the same thing.
No. These are people who think Russia and China.
I know, but they also have
wrong.
Their avatars online are almost always anime girls.
They are funded by Russia.
Yeah.
I don't know how you don't know that. In fact, I would argue that more money has gone from Russia to create Antifa than has gone to create the pro-Trump movement. And people who think otherwise are just blind to what's going on. It is a good thing, for us at least, that that Putin has decided to get rid of his own people. Now, it's not that we couldn't have a productive relationship with the Slavic people, but we would need very different politics on the ground, and we'd probably need to turn Russia into a client state of the United States, which I think is the best outcome of all of this, given how weak Russia is becoming. Which could still happen if we play specific cards right. If when the power struggle does come for who takes over after Putin, the US-backed faction wins. Because I think that we've sort of gotten over this whole spreading democracy everywhere, and understand that US favorable dictators within some regions are just going to be more stable and lead to less overall suffering than trying to put democracies in cultures that don't. I mean, Russia's often called a kleptocracy, but it's not really a kleptocracy. It's a stable company.
Very interesting. Well, I mean, yeah, this was eye-opening for me. So fun conversation.
Yeah, it's going to really piss off some of our watchers. I know that, because this is one of those things that a lot of people on the right really have their mind made up about. And it's such a silly thing. And just on other, we are super pro-Israel in the Israel war. On other issues, we take the staunchly conservative side, but I don't mind if we're destroying what's left of the communist empire.
So there you have it. I love you, Malcolm Collins.
I love you too.